Dastiari.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I just want to begin by saying that these are never easy debates. These are never easy issues. I don't envy anyone who has the responsibility for making these kinds of decisions, especially when they relate to the lives of others. I do want to say, though, that I respect the fact that good people can disagree with each other, that different views can be held, that while my view may not concur with all views that have been expressed in this Parliament and in this chamber, I certainly respect the fact that in a debate like this, good people with good intentions can have a different view than the one that I'll be sharing with this chamber. I rise today to join my colleagues in this Parliament in expressing in the plainest terms my greatest concern for the lives and livelihoods of the people of northern Iraq and north-western Syria who are being butchered with medieval brutality by the so-called Islamic State. Now, a lot of my friends in this chamber who know me well know my story. Know that when I was 5 years old, I fled Iran during the Iran-Iraq war to come to this country. I came to this country because it was a place of peace, a place of hope, and a place of opportunity. And I also came here because I wanted to be part of a country, part of a society that also wouldn't turn its back on others. I believe the Australia of today has a responsibility for those who are suffering in northern Iraq, has a responsibility for those who are suffering in Syria, and has a responsibility as a middle independent power to behave when we can behave in a reasonable and sensible fashion, to do what we can to minimise and wherever possible stop genocide, stop hurt and stop suffering. Now, there are senators here today who have raised that the government and previous governments and current governments perhaps haven't done enough in other areas, in other conflicts, have raised the spectre of Sri Lanka or sub-Saharan Africa. Let me put my view on the record. I believe Australia, as a middle power that's independent, should and can be doing a lot more in a lot of different areas. We should be using our aid budget. We should be using our resources. We should be, where appropriate, expressing our influence and our power to do the right thing by those who are suffering. But that debate, which is a separate debate, doesn't negate the fact that there is horror, there is genocide, and there is brutality going on right now, and right now there is something we, as an Australian Parliament, can do about it. 2 weeks ago, I was standing in a refugee camp in Jordan, not far from the Syrian border, hearing the stories of the tens of thousands of people who have fled Syria, a few of whom who had fled Iraq, who are fleeing not only the horrors of the so-called Islamic State, but also the horrors of the Assad regime. People who have given up everything to flee the brutality that they're currently facing. You know, only a few days before, I met a man who had just arrived in the camp with his entire family from northern Syria. He was unshaven, he was scarred, he was burnt by the sun. He'd been walking for 30 days with his 3 children and his wife to flee. We have a responsibility to those people. We have a responsibility as global citizens, as a global middle power, to do what we can to make sure that those people and their suffering doesn't go on. Mr. Acting Deputy President, it's an honour to be part of this kind of debate. And as my other colleagues have reiterated, there is no greater responsibility in the service of our nation than any decision to deploy the men and women of our defence forces. It is always always a serious and difficult decision, and I accept the fact that different people will come to this from different views. But I want to reiterate the statements made by others in the opposition to affirm our appreciation that the government and the defence officials have provided us with the briefings before this was announced, and I add my voice to those others in this place in condemning the actions of the barbaric murderers who have butchered their way across the Kurdish territories. This is not the world we can simply stand by and allow to propagate. This is not a situation that should be allowed to be tolerated. The fact is, we can have a debate, and we can have a different debate about what decisions have and haven't been made in the past, about what actions have and haven't been taken, about initial entries into Iraq and where it was or wasn't appropriate, and if we're able to do it all again, what should and shouldn't have been done. But the fact remains that right now, right here, there is something the Australian government can do and the Australian government should do. I want to raise my voice also in support of the many Assyrian, Iraqi, Kurdish nationals who are living in Australia, whose stories aren't that different from mine, many of whom faced the brutality under the Saddam regime when they migrated to this country in a way not that dissimilar than I migrated to this country. And their voices, their concerns, their worry about what is going on in Iraq, about what is happening in northern Syria. And none of this should be conflated in any way as some kind of an endorsement of the actions of the Assad regime, or an endorsement of al-Nusra, or an endorsement of any of the other players in that region. No. What we're saying is this: if there is genocide going on around the world and we can stop it, we have a responsibility to stop it. If there is horror, there is pain, there is suffering, and we, as an independent middle power, have the ability and the opportunity to do something about it, we shouldn't shy away from that simply because it's too difficult or simply because the local politics make it all too hard. This is about doing what's right. This is about doing what we've all been sent here to do. And frankly, this is what Australia does best. Now, I appreciate that the government, and I appreciate the right of the government to make these decisions. I also appreciate that this isn't a government that has made this decision lightly, that it has the support of the Defence Forces, that they took the relevant and necessary steps to properly brief the opposition before making this kind of an announcement, as they appropriately should do. I call on the Defence Minister to keep his commitment and maintain a level of dialogue as these events unfold with the opposition. And I also want to reiterate what the Leader of the Labor Party, Bill Shorten, said earlier. When, in support of the decision, he really outlined two tests for the opposition. Firstly, that it is about responding effectively to the humanitarian crisis in Iraq to prevent genocide and to relieve suffering. But secondly, and I think this sometimes gets overlooked, doing what we can to promote a unity government in Iraq that is inclusive, that can achieve national cohesion, reject sectarianism and the alienation of minorities. It has to be about the long-term interests of Iraq. And frankly, we as an Australian Parliament, as an Australian government and as Australian people cannot sit idly by, cannot allow these events to happen on the other side of the world and argue that because it's so far, because it hasn't directly impacted us yet, because it's on the other side of the world, that we don't have a responsibility, that we don't have a role. Mr. Acting Deputy President, where there's pain, where there's suffering, where there's hurt, where there is genocide, and when Australia can do something about it, we always have a responsibility to play our role.
Thank you, Senator Dastyari. The question is that the Senate take note